What's good, YouTube? Today we've got a range tier list for Season 2 of Dragonflight. We're likely not to see too many changes before the start of the next season, so these are my predictions. We're going to start with the Elemental Shaman, which I'm going to whack straight in the A tier. I would say this is a low A tier spec in comparison to some of the other A tiers. We'll get onto those later. But Elemental Shaman did receive a single target buff quite recently, so that is going to help them a lot there. That is definitely something they needed. They are amazing in AoE, and that is being helped by their tier set going into next patch. They are getting a Stormkeeper every 40 seconds. This has just been reduced to 1 charge of your Stormkeeper instead of the 2. I thought that was the case anyway, but apparently you were getting 2. It's only 1 now, but this is going to be an amazing tier set going into next season for Mythic Plus. Having that extra Stormkeeper proc during an AoE fight is going to be insane. Massive Maelstrom gem, massive damage at the same time, and Elemental was already incredible in AoE scenarios. They definitely did struggle with single target as well, but like I mentioned, they have received some buffs recently. From their 4 set as well, they're also getting some more Maelstrom generation, so that is definitely going to help out their single target. I saw Petco on stream doing very respectable single target damage on his Elemental Shaman, so I think this spec is going to be very strong for next season. In general, I think the Elemental Shaman is always slept on in Mythic Plus. It has amazing utility. You've got your Cap Totem, you've got your Earth Ellie to help out your tank and recover from any wipes that could be possible. You've got the shortest kick in the game. You've also got Ancestral Guidance, which is amazing off healing coming from the Elemental Shaman or the Shaman in general. The only problem that Elemental does suffer from is the fact that it is quite a squishy class. They did get a bit tankier coming into Dragonflight with the buffs to Astral Shift. However, it's not up there with the tankiest of specs, so that definitely does limit them. All in all, a very solid pick going into next season. Next, we have the Devastation Evoker, which I think is going to surprise a lot of people next season, and it definitely has surprised me already on the PTR. It is pumping out some insane damage. They have some of the best front-loaded AoE bursts in the game. You really cannot compete with them. They are demons in AoE, and they have some decent single target as well. Obviously, they are losing the Evoker staff going into next patch, but with the talent rework and also the tier set just giving them passive extra damage, that definitely helps their single target as well. From what I've seen on the PTR, the tier set is doing around 10% of your overall damage over the course of a key, which is just insane, and it is completely passive as well. So they are looking very, very strong for next patch from a damage perspective. Like the Elemental Shaman, they do unfortunately lack in the defensives department. They're arguably a bit more tanky than the Elemental Shaman. They've got 2 charges of their hardened scales. They've also got Zephyr, which is some really nice utility for your group. They've got multiple stops through their tail swipe and their knockback ability as well. You've got the deep breath stun if you talent into it, which I'm sure you guys will be doing. And most importantly, they are one of the few Lust classes in the game as well. This is definitely some very handy utility and would definitely help you get into more groups if you're pugging. And for these reasons, I'm going to whack the Devoker in the top of A tier. It is looking like a machine going into next season. Another machine going into next season is the Shadow Priest. They're having another rework going into 10.1. I know, when will it ever stop? But this is looking like a very promising rework for the spec. From a numbers perspective anyway, because I know a lot of Shadow Priest mains aren't too happy with the direction that the Shadow Priest gameplay is going. Their tier set is feeding into the Psychic Link gameplay even more, which is a very, very potent damage profile for Mythic Plus, feeding all of that damage into a priority target and cleaving pretty much passively onto surrounding enemies. By default, with your Shadow Crash ability, you're probably going to be cleaving on a minimum of 8 targets. That being said though, you probably will dot up a few more mobs if there are any more present, and then you're just going to be absolutely blasting on the meters. This spec is looking scary for next season, especially in AoE. It is pumping out some ridiculous numbers, and like I said, the damage profile, having that prior damage is very, very important in Mythic Plus. If you're enjoying the video, please consider hitting that subscribe button. The only downside of this damage profile is I feel like it will hold back their single target a little bit, because obviously Blizzard aren't going to be able to buff their single target without indirectly buffing their AoE at the same time. So their single target isn't looking the strongest. It's still looking good, but just not the strongest. So they are going to struggle there in comparison to their AoE, where they are going to be on top form. Like I mentioned with the Shadow Crash ability as well, this is also going to help the ramp that the class has always suffered with. So you're going to start off packs with a big old burst and then be able to sustain that and even creep up while other specs are going to fall down. I have to mention Power Infusion. Obviously, this is a massive, massive input of damage from a Shadow Priest over the course of a key, regardless of how much damage the Shadow Priest is actually pumping out itself. If you add a power infusion to the mix, you are contributing an incredible amount of damage over the course of a dungeon. Outside of power infusion, they have some decent utility. It's not the greatest in the world. They give your party 10% stamina, which is just a nice safety net in Mythic Plus. They have Mass Dispel as well, which is very handy for getting rid of multiple debuffs at the same time. They've got Vampiric Embrace as well, which was responsible somewhat for the 4 DPS and 1 tank keys that we saw in Season 1, which also is going to help with their tankiness. They've got their shields for tankiness as well. They generally are quite a tanky spec, and for this reason, we're whacking the Shadow Priest straight into the S tier. This is definitely looking like one of the strongest range for next season. I don't think anybody can argue with that right now, so a big S for Shadow. Next, we have the Marksmanship Hunter. They have a bit of a lackluster tier set, giving them an extra bit of single target damage and a bit of extra cleave as well. Hopefully this gets a rework at some point, because even with the talents that it should open up, it's still not going to do that, because you're still going to want to press multi-shot, because that's going to be doing a lot of damage next season. They have insane burst AoE potential, but unfortunately this does fall off in higher keys where other specs can climb. And surprisingly, going into next season, they actually have really respectable single target damage, being able to talent into their Windrunner's Guidance, which did get nerfed recently, but you still have a ridiculous uptime on True Shot, really helping out with that single target damage that they lacked before. They do bring some unique utility as a hunter as well. You've got your Binding Shot or your Scatter Shot, which I feel like a lot of people do actually forget that we can take that as an extra single target stop, especially nice for pugging. You can summon a pet for lust, though with Marksmanship specifically, it is very finicky and I hated doing it in Season 1. And then you have your Traps as well, which is nice for some extra stops or some slowing utility. Being a hunter as well, you are on the squishier side of things, especially as an MM hunter. You do have access to quite a few defensives, but I do feel like you just fall over, especially as this spec. So for the Marksmanship Hunter, I'm going to whack this one in B tier for now. It's going to end up being on the lower end of the B tier, but still definitely a viable spec. Maybe not such a viable spec, then we're going to move on to the Arcane Mage. The tier set for next season seems really weird and counterintuitive. Surely you would want to pull all of your damage into your cooldowns, specifically as an Arcane Mage. We all know the burst potential this class has, but they seem to be trying to bridge the gap. Don't really understand it. But the Arcane Mage's rotation alone is a very, very difficult one to perform in Mythic Plus. But once you've got it down, I'm sure it's not too hard, but dealing with all the Mythic Plus mechanics at the same time, you've got the affixes, different mobs running around you. Not being able to stand still in DPS like you would on a training dummy is going to really impact your rotation and therefore your DPS. And when compared to the other two mage specs as well, it really is a lot of effort for little reward. I'm also very skeptical about how the 4 set's going to work in an AoE situation, because most of your spenders and abilities aren't really spending too much mana, if at all, in an AoE scenario. So I'm really struggling to see where you get the value out of your 4 set. Being a mage though, you do have some nice utility. You've got your Arcane Intellect, which is especially nice for caster comps. You've got your Bloodlust as well, and also talents like Dragon's Breath, which is nice for an AoE stop. Mage is one of those classes as well that if you play well and know where the damage is coming, you can be a tanky spec. With abilities like Alter Time, where you can literally just pretend that the damage didn't happen as long as you time it correctly, you've got your Ice Block, and you've also got your barriers. Like I mentioned though, when you do compare the Arcane Mage to its Fire and Frost counterparts, it's really kind of lackluster, and for that reason, I'm going to put this one in the C tier. Onto the Beast Mastery Hunter then, it does look like the tier set is going to give us some nice damage going into next season. The 2 set is just going to be a flat damage buff to our single target, which is also going to translate into AoE through Kill Cleave. And just generally, we're going to have more uptime on our Bestial Wrath, which is going to give us more damage over the course of a key. I do question it though, because we do already have a very high uptime on Bestial Wrath, so we'll have to see how much this actually impacts our damage, but it could definitely open up new builds like the Cobra Shot build, as we're going to get a lot more CDR value when we're firing out those 3 Cobra Shots when we're in our Aspect of the Wild. Beast Mastery has some of the best single target in the game, and also some very nice sustained AoE, especially on mass pulls. I wouldn't consider Beast Mastery a squishy spec anymore. I mained the spec in Season 1, and towards the end of the season, I definitely felt like one of the tankiest specs. You've got your Fortitude of the Bear and Survival of the Fittest, which are very nice and potent defensive cooldowns. You've got your Exhilaration on a very short cooldown, especially with all the CDR it receives. And obviously you have your Turtle as well as a pseudo immunity. As a Beast Mastery Hunter as well, you get a bit of extra utility in comparison to the Marksmanship Hunter, in the way of a single target stun through Intimidation. Like I mentioned for the MM Hunter, you've got your Binding Shot, you've got your Traps. It's easier to Lust as a BM hunter as well, although you do lose a defensive. Blizzard, please sort that out. So in my opinion, the Beast Mastery is definitely a better pick than the Marksmanship Hunter for next season, and for that reason, I'm going to whack this in the top of the B tier for now. On to Destro Lock then, which I'm really hesitant as to where I'm placing this spec. The tier set for next season is definitely a weird one, though I do feel like people really are sleeping on it. Getting that extra fire damage is going to be huge for Destro, especially on the AoE pools that it's already a king of. In those massive AoE pools, you really cannot come close to the Destro Warlock. It is an absolute monster. It's got some decent single target damage as well. The only scenario that the Destro Warlock does lack is up to those 5 targets in those cleave scenarios. It definitely does struggle to keep up in these kinds of pools, and this is mostly what's got me questioning the placement of the Destro Warlock for next season, because in some dungeons you are going to be able to do those mass AoE pools, for example your freeholds, maybe your Brackenhide Hollows as well, but then there are definitely some dungeons as well that are quite linear and have those smaller pools. Being a Warlock, they are one of the tankiest classes in the game. You've got your Hellstones, which is also a nice piece of utility for your group as well. You've got lots of passive shielding, you've got Unending Resolve, you've got Dark Pact. The list really goes on for the Warlock. It is an absolute tank of a class. It does bring some niche utility as well. You've got your gateways for any skips that we do find out about. Like I mentioned, you've got the Healthstones, specific to the Destro Warlock as well. You've got some Infernal stuns, and also an AoE stun in Shadow Fury. As I said, I'm not convinced where I'm placing this. It's definitely going to be a high A tier or even a possible S tier. For now, I'm going to play it safe and put it in the top of A tier. But dependent on the size of the pools, the higher the keys and how your tank pulls, the Destro Warlock could definitely be an S tier spec. Similar to the Destruction Warlock, we also have the Demonology Warlock as well, which I'm going to place in the top of the A tier too. These two could definitely be interchangeable depending on the week, dependent on the affixes. Demonology's tier set is looking insane for next season, giving you that 1.5 minute burst damage profile with your Tyrant and your Felguard at the same time. Regardless of what type of pull it is, whether it's AoE or if it's a boss fight, it's going to allow you to do some insane damage, buffing up all your demons and also doing damage themselves. This is really nice as well because you're getting that priority damage on those mobs that do need to die quickly. Demo has some really strong cleave damage as well through their Dreadstalkers, and this means that they're not too reliant on how the tank or group pulls, because regardless of the situation, they can deal insane damage. Again, being a Warlock, you are incredibly tanky. You really are going to struggle to die on these classes. And you also bring some nice utility for your group in the way of Healthstones. So I just want to reiterate that these two could easily be swapped out or even end up in the S tier. They are very high A tier. And dependent on the dungeon and how the tank pulls, you could easily see either of these being better than the other and better than most of the range specs. Next, we move on to the Fire Mage. It did just receive a 6% damage nerf to Ignite, which as we know is pretty much most of its damage. So prior to this, it probably would have had a higher ranking, although it's still going to be a high ranking, don't you worry. The tier set does seem pretty underwhelming for next season, but this doesn't really matter because Fire just does so much damage by itself anyway. We all know how strong those combustion windows are, and Fire Mage scales really well with secondary stats as well, which is going to help them even more going into next season. Fire also has the benefit of having one of the best damage profiles in the game, firing all that insane burst damage into a priority target and then passively cleaving, which is pretty much uncapped as well. You really cannot ask for a better damage profile, especially in Mythic Plus. I would also personally argue that Fire doesn't rely as much as it used to on how the tank pulls. This is because you have much more frequent combustions now with your Sun King's Blessing. Obviously, the larger the pool, the better for the Fire Mage, but it doesn't really matter that much anymore, in my opinion. It has some great single target damage as well, which is especially nice for those tyrannical weeks. And to get the most out of your Fire Mage, they are definitely going to perform much, much better on those higher keys, where the mobs are going to live that much longer, allowing that Ignite to spread and tick. Fire Mage is also arguably the tankiest of the mage specs, being able to talent into Cauterize. I know a lot of mages don't, but having a cheat death is completely broken, so I have no idea why they don't. But the option is there, and it is a very good one at that. Like I mentioned for the Arcane Mage as well, you bring some nice utility to the group. You've got your Arcane Intellect, you've got Lust, you've got Dragon's Breath for an AoE stop. And so for the Fire Mage, it's definitely going in the A tier. Again, I'm struggling with where to put it, but I think I'm going to put it just behind the Devastation Evoker. It could probably climb up a few places the higher the key goes because of how the Fire Mage works, but I think the Devastation Evoker is just doing too much damage right now to be placed behind it. Balanced Druid then, they are losing their insanely overpowered tier set from Season 1. The new tier set is decent, but specifically for AoE, it's really not going to help too much with single target, and that is definitely something we're going to see from the Balanced Druids next season. They are really going to struggle on those single target encounters. The AoE might be able to carry them. I've seen balanced druids doing a lot of damage on the PTR, and they're also not going to have as much ramp time now that you don't have to apply up to 20 stellar flares to get your damage rolling. But the balanced druid is definitely taking a big blow from season 1, where they were pretty much on top the whole season. Balance is a really tanky spec though. Whenever you know there's some big damage coming in, just drop into bear form. You've got bark skin on a short cooldown as well. You've got your well-honed instincts talent, renewal for an instant heal if you need it, and nature's vigil for some passive healing if you need it, and also for your group, which is some really nice utility that the balanced druid brings. Balance has always been the king of utility for Mythic Plus in my opinion. You've got your solar beam, which is very unique and very broken when you can stack mobs up and lock them out. You've got your Incat Roar for another AoE stop, Ursul's Vortex and Typhoon, which can be used as another AoE stop or even to help your tank out. And then you also bring the Mark of the Wild buff for your group, which is going to really help out over the course of a dungeon. I do think balance is going to be strong for next season, and hopefully the AoE can carry their lacking single target. And from what I've seen, it has been, so I'm going to put the balanced druid in the bottom of the A tier for now. I don't think it matches up with all of these specs, but the utility it brings is just invaluable, so we're whacking it straight in the A tier. Moving on to Frost Mage, we're getting some extra cleave from your tier set next season. Nothing really to write home about, but it is some nice extra cleave, which is always good for Mythic Plus. I'm also wondering if this new tier set could open up the Cold Front build for Frost Mage like we saw at the end of Shadowlands. This build performs really well in mass AoE, which is definitely something that Frost was lacking in season 1. But outside of that, you're not really gaining anything going into next season. Your single target's going to be propped up a bit with the 4-set damage on Ice Lance. Frost was already good at single target, so I don't feel like this buff was really necessary, but I feel like they needed to do this, otherwise we wouldn't press Ice Lance. And unfortunately, Frost is kind of one of those specs that does rely somewhat on the tank for their Icy Veins uptime. So in a coordinated group, Frost is definitely going to perform better. You might struggle a little bit in your pugs. Again, like I mentioned earlier, for the mage specs, if you play them well defensively, you are quite a tanky spec. Specific to the Frost Mage, you've got double Ice Block, which can save you in a lot of situations. And also specific to the Frost Mage as well, you pretty much have permanent uptime on slows on the enemies if your tank does need to kite. So for the Frost Mage then, I'm going to whack this one in the top of the B tier. The damage is looking somewhat decent, but it's the utility that really carries the spec and separates it from the Hunter specs in the same tier. Finally then, we have the Affliction Warlock. Going into next season then, with the new tier set, you're going to have a lot more of a burstier damage profile. Your cooldowns are seeming to line up a lot better as well, and you're going to have this up for every pack. Affliction was already a beast in mass AoE, but I don't know how much of that we're going to see next season, unfortunately. The new tier set is definitely going to help out its lacking single target as well, but unfortunately, when compared with the other specs in the Warlock class, it just does not even cut it close. It definitely is still a decent spec, but it is just not in the same league as Destro and Demo. It brings some nice survivability to the group as well through the health stones. You've got your gateways and also your summoning stones if you've done a skip. And being a Warlock, like I've already mentioned, it is a very tanky class. So for that reason, I'm going to whack the Affliction Warlock in the middle of the B tier, just in front of the Marksmanship Hunter. Affliction is going to deal some very respectable damage next season, I believe. The tier set seems to be really helping them out, and that is why I'm placing them in the B tier. So those are my overall predictions for range going into next season. It is looking like a really promising season for range players. A lot of the mechanics seem to be targeted towards melee players, so range is going to have it comfy sitting away at 40 yards. And a lot of the range specs as well are looking very strong from a numbers perspective. Let me know down in the comments below what you guys think of my placements and also where I placed your spec. If you enjoyed the video, then drop a like while you're down there too. Subscribe to your boy if you're new, and until next time, I'll catch you guys later.